All right, good morning. We're going to go ahead and spend today talking about the U.S. in World War I. You guys have been doing a lot of reading lately about the war prior to our involvement, and then also how the war itself affected the United States on the home front and some of the controversial stuff surrounding that. But rather than focus on that for today, what my goal is to just kind of give you a quick overview of those final years of the war, that last kind of 6-month period where the United States gets involved and we help push the war to its close, and some of the kind of highlight some of the changes that come about as a result of that. We're not going to talk a lot about battles today because there just really aren't that many. It's going to be more about just why the United States mattered and what was so significant about us contributing to World War I. As I said in the email, I'll be sending out a copy of these slides as well so that you can use those to follow along or review some of the stuff that I cover if you would like. I would note, however, that there will be some things that I go into a bit more detail in on this presentation because I can talk through it. And to keep that in mind, so that it might be worth doing a full watch through just so you can kind of pick up on those things or not. Entirely up to you. If you don't want to listen to my voice, I don't blame you. So here we go. As you guys should have at this point been pretty familiar with, the United States does in fact join World War I, and it's going to happen in April of 1917. And it's going to be due primarily to the Germans violating the free trade agreement. So you guys have previously read about the Lusitania, the Zimmermann telegram, these singular events that make us kind of salty towards the Germans, and this is the straw that kind of breaks the camel's back. Predominantly, our frustration and entry into the war can be summed up as being economic. While we were friends with Britain, we liked France, at the end of the day, the United States had remained neutral for those years from 1914 to 1917 because we just didn't care. Like, it was the very American response, right, that you see even today, where we're like, "Cool, that's quite terrible for them. No, thank you. That's not our problem. Have fun." We get involved because it becomes our problem, and specifically our monetary problem. I would note that the Lusitania, ironically, is not actually kind of this tipping point, although it gets a lot of acclaim. The Lusitania actually gets sunk in 1915, so like 2 years before we get involved in the war. And while we were really unhappy about that, we threw this huge hissy fit, and at the time, Germany definitely didn't want us in the war, and they thought that they could win, so they said, all right, sorry, our bad, we won't sink your ships anymore, that's totally on us. Follow your dreams, trade with whoever you want, stay out of it, America. And that's how it stayed for a really long time. And that was predominantly the issue. Yes, we're salty when the Zimmermann telegram shows that they're trying to get Mexico to turn on us, but also at the same time, America's like, okay, whatever. Like, we kicked the crap out of Mexico. What are they going to do, really, Germany? It's the fact that in 1917, the war is coming to a close. Things are really bad at this point. Like France, Germany, Britain, everybody is running low on troops. And Germany in particular is super desperate to try and win the war. And they make a decision, right, where they're like, okay, well, we need Britain to stop helping France. Like, we can't take them both. We can definitely take just France, though. And so the German high command officially decides, all right, we're going to start sinking ships again. We just got to do it. They send out a bunch of announcements warning the United States, saying, hey guys, we're going to start this again. Don't go sailing, but for the U.S., that's too much. They're like, no, you're not about to threaten our livelihood, our money. And this is the point where Wilson effectively says, all right, look, guys, Germany's coming for our boats. They're coming for our trade. We got to step in. And so we declare war in 1917. And we run into the traditional U.S. problem of we're not actually ready to fight in a war. Same deal as the Spanish-American War, where we didn't have the right clothes and people got hot because you don't go to a island tropical environment with wool clothing. Similarly, the United States did not even kind of have the supplies, the soldiers necessary to participate in a large-scale conflict. At the declaration of war, we only had 200,000 soldiers. To put that into context, from the entirety of the war, just at the Battle of the Somme, right? So the single most bloody battle, prior to our involvement, 1.2 million soldiers died. That's just died, not that fought, died. That is 6 times the number of soldiers that we had at the time. So we are just like wildly unprepared in number-wise. On top of that, we don't have the weapons. Like, we have weapons for 200,000 people, and we have ships for way less than that. And we don't even have the food. We don't have the clothing, nothing. Like, we have nothing. And so overnight, President Wilson has to take the steps to make the United States ready to go. And so he'll pass a bunch of laws, and he'll make 5,000 different agencies to manage and win the war. And some of these are the ones that you read about in the controversy, but some of them also are newer ones. And so I just want to very quickly go through some of those kind of changes he does to help mobilize the United States. Before we do that, though, the United States also, I really want to emphasize, joins for economic reasons. This is a war for us. We help Britain, we help France, but it's not because we're like super concerned about whether or not the French are going to stay in charge or not. We are concerned about our own economic interests. And so when we go into the war, we want to do our own thing. And we also see a little bit of that nationalism, the American exceptionalism, ironically, the stuff that kind of caused the problem with the war to begin with. In that Wilson, he appoints John Pershing as the leader of the American Expeditionary Force, the group that was going to be the United States' face of the war effort in Europe, and says, you go help them, but you don't listen. And like, you decide where we help and when. You decide what battles we participate in. We are there to help them, but at the end of the day, we are here for America and American reasons. And that's going to kind of bite us in the butt, as we'll talk about later on. But it just kind of, again, highlights this very American attitude of, like, when we get involved, even if we're not prepared, like, no, America knows best. We know what we want. We're going to do our own thing. On a side note, John Pershing, just a little bit of background on him. He was a veteran of all of the most recent American conflicts, the Spanish-American War, the American-Philippines War, where we burned villages and killed a lot of people in the Philippines. And just to note, because while his accomplishments are noteworthy, it's also important to be aware that, like, we continue to have a sort of history. John Pershing, the same guy that's going to be this hero in leading American troops to win World War I, also ordered the execution of local Philippine resistance fighters and civilians, and had their bodies buried with pigs as an insult to anyone that would try and resist American oppression. So again, it's important to note that, like, we still very much have the imperialist legacy that we had right before we get involved in this conflict. All right, so we passed the Selective Service Act. That's the first major reform, the draft, to get 2.8 million Americans drafted in the military. Anywhere from ages 18 to 45 was a target group, similar to today. And we needed soldiers. Like, we had to have a lot because everybody else did. It's the first major global conflict that we're ever participating in. And so, you know, we'll take whatever we can get and whoever we can get. And so we also see 400,000 black soldiers drafted to serve. But ironically, we see this sort of twisted presentation, right, where we're trying to get African Americans to fight because we need a lot of soldiers. And so they had these really patriotic pieces of propaganda where, like, you can see Abraham Lincoln is looking down from the grave, encouraging them to go and fight for American independence. The colored man is no slacker. He can go and he can fight, and he's brave, but not brave enough to fight with everybody else, only with other black people. And so again, kind of highlighting that even when we as Americans engage in these very patriotic moments where we try and defend American ideals, or we say we're going to fight for freedom, at the end of the day, we still are a troubled country. We still are like, yeah, we're going to fight for freedom, but not everyone's freedom, just some little equality, but not a lot. And again, true sons of freedom, but not so free that we mix them. That's wrong. So again, just worth noting. I'd like to go to the next slide. Hey, there we go. All right. So we also see the War Industries Board created, which is designed to oversee the production of military supplies. And what we actually see is the forcing of various businesses to mass produce war equipment. So like if you previously were a chair factory, you know, my favorite example factory, now that chair factory might be turned into a rifle factory because we don't really need chairs to win World War I, but we do need lots of rifles. Or If you previously were producing nuts and bolts for cars, like the Ford factories, now you're going to make bullets because you got the basic machinery necessary to do it. Excuse me, I don't have corona. But now we also need to kind of shift that over to the thing that's going to win the war. An interesting side note and parallel to today, speaking of the corona, the War Industries Board is part of a wartime law that gets passed that allows the president to force various businesses to adopt production. That has been used in numerous times for crisis from this point forward, and actually could be used even today. So like, for example, if you've heard that some factories are starting to produce coronavirus testing kits, that could be forced by the president today because it's considered a wartime emergency or a national emergency. And so he could use the powers created by the War Industry Board to force factories across the United States to produce coronavirus testing kits. And so again, just an example of how like these changes are massive. They may seem small and only wartime, but it has long-lasting implications. We also see the Food Administration was created, and they're going to be there to ration food because we are sending, 2.8 million people overseas, which in comparison, that is half the population of Chicago. So we're sending just like half of Chicago, every other person gone, they're overseas, and we got to feed them. And so we start to see them really pushing, as you can see the propaganda, various ways to try and preserve supplies to send to those soldiers. So the idea, they started to have meatless days, or they would encourage meatless days, where like you'd maybe do like meatless Mondays. And so they would say, in your household, you like bacon, but you know who also likes bacon? Our American soldiers fighting and dying for freedom. What they would really like if they could have your bacon. So why don't you not have bacon today so that they can eat? And things like that. Wheat was really emphasized too because, bread, it's very easy to send abroad. We also see the idea of victory gardens. So they emphasize that you should try and grow your own food if you can and be self-sustaining. So peas, tomatoes, things like that. Why don't you make your own, grow a lot, and jar them, save them, preserve them as long as you can, and then you don't have to buy any, and we can send that food that the farmers grow to our soldiers to help win the war. And you get some really entertaining sort of propaganda where you have the Kaiser, the German king, because this is a spooky guy in the dark, and you need to grow some peas so that the soldiers can win the war. Defeat the Kaiser and his U-boats. Victory depends on which fails first, food or frightfulness. So like equating your fear of the Germans to your ability to grow tomatoes or maybe some parsley. And part of the reason I'm including all of these propaganda pieces is I really want to emphasize too that this is very all-inclusive. Most of our wars throughout, like I've mentioned before, throughout our history, predominantly do not directly impact your lives. Like the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Spanish-American War. None of these things, like you hear about them and like, oh, cool, our soldiers are fighting. Oh, they took a hill, neat, cool, awesome. Go America. But like, it doesn't directly affect you. You don't see TV ads that are like, you need to save your meat and send it abroad so that we can defeat the Taliban. Like, that's just not the world that we live in anymore. And so this is like a very all-inclusive conflict, and it'll be similar like that in World War II. Again, just more Uncle Sam says, garden to cut food costs, because, you gotta do what you can. If you can't fight, you can grow some tomatoes or squash or onions. Yeah, onions. We also see the Fuel Administration created in order to ration coal and oil, because this is another example of how this is very much like the first modern conflict, where this is the first large-scale conflict where we're using modern technology like cars and later on planes, and at the very, very end, tanks. And so we need to save all of those things for the war effort. We need to save every single drop. And they were like real strict on it too. You'll note, like, not only are you saving gasoline, but they're saying don't spill any, don't let it leak, don't use it for washing, run engines while standing. Like, they literally were so concerned about conserving this that they said, you need, like, if your car is sitting outside, like, you turn that sucker off if you're gonna go talk to your neighbor, and then you come back and you turn it back on. And you do not waste anything. And then my personal favorite, all of these things that you've seen thus far in the slides are from the Committee on Public Information, and the CPI was created to make sure that you were on board with the war effort, that everybody was putting America first. The United States tends to be very good at uniting behind war efforts, and that's in part because of organizations like this, where they would go out of their way to make it seem like it is your patriotic duty to help win the First World War, because we got 3 million people fighting. You need to do your part. So, you know, the second official United States war pictures, America's Answer, they would make these like propaganda films where it would be recordings of US soldiers doing training drills or running out of the trench, but never actually fighting. So remember, that was horrifying. Lots of death. There's actually so bad that they would not permit people to see the take photos of the actual battlefield because it was so horrifying. And you'll find that it's actually difficult even today to find photo evidence of the actual battle. You'll find the trenches, you'll find the battlefield after, but you'll never see much in the way of actual charges or people fighting. Also, it's worth noting that the CPI is the one that censors speech and the press. So when you guys read about Schenck v. the United States, this is them. They're the ones who are like, boy, you can't be going and fighting the draft. Put him in prison. Things like that. Again, defend your country. Uncle Sam, the traditional I want you for the U.S. Army, that like quintessential piece of American propaganda comes out of World War I. They also encourage bond drives. And this is not James Bond, Super Spy Man. This is instead referring to what it equates to loaning money to the government, because when you have to pay for a war effort, you suddenly have to come up with a lot of money out of nowhere. And so the way that the government did it, and they'll do this again in World War II, is they created these things called war bonds, where the way it would work is you would go and you would effectively donate money to the government. So you might buy a war bond for like $100, and you would give 100 of your dollars to the government, and the government would use that to pay for bullets or bacon or chips or whatever they need to win the war. And then the motive for you is that they would pay you interest on it, like a traditional loan. So like when you go to the bank, as long as you have the bank's money, you have to pay interest on it. So you pay them back all the money that you took. Similarly, the government would pay back interest on the money that you loaned them. So it was seen as an investment in your country, not dying to the tyranny abroad. In exchange, you hopefully win the war. In practice, there's mixed results in the actual payout of the interest. But again, it's the United States. It's an all-in effort. Everybody donates. And so just more examples of the bond. Over the top for you, buy used government bonds, Third Liberty Loan. Remember your first thrill of American liberty. So it's important to note that they catered to like everybody. See this Ellis Island perspective, the idea that we, you know, you came to America, we gave you an opportunity at liberty, now it's your time to chip back in. Pay us your dues. This idea, you came to a land of opportunity, we gave it to you, now you got to help defend it. And also playing off the fear on the left, you can see, of the U-boat, because up until we actually get involved with the war, that was our biggest interaction with World War I, is German submarines sinking our ships. And so this all takes about 6 months. So while we declare war in April of 1917, we won't actually get involved until 1918, and then it's go time. An interesting side note, just to lastly kind of drive home how unprepared for war we were up to this point. When we started shipping soldiers to France, many of them had to go through training boot camp in France itself because they hadn't had time to do it in the United States. But also, we were so understaffed with ships that we literally had the government go and take cruise ships using that war board where they would force you to build stuff. They would literally say, all right, that's a nice cruise ship you got there. You can't do that right now. We got to move the soldiers. So we're just going to take that. We're going to put like 10,000 soldiers on it, and it's going to France, and hopefully it doesn't get sank. So see you later. We also would steal some German ships because Germany's the enemy. And speaking of U-boats and the potential for being sank, in reality, there wasn't actually that big of a problem, because once the United States gets involved, if you recall, during the age of imperialism, right before this, we had the second largest fleet in the world, and lo and behold, we're going to put that sucker to use. And so what we see is the first problem we solve is the U-boat problem. And what the United States does is we create the convoy system, where we will put a ton of time and money into just making sure that our ships, our naval ships, escort our merchant ships to and from Great Britain so that U-boats can't come after them. And if you can kind of see in the image up on the board, the idea was basically that you would treat it almost like a herd of pack animals, where a U-boat would need to be able to get a clear line of fire to the merchant ships. And at this time, they would have to surface to fire. So they would surround the merchant ships with U.S. destroyers and cruisers, creating this defensive perimeter. So if the U-boat wanted to surface to fire, all of these ships would be able to see it, and they would also be able to block the line of fire. So now not only are they not likely to be able to hit the merchant ships, it's super dangerous for the U-boat to surface, because now you've got like 4 or 5 ships that are going to open fire on you. And so overnight, almost, this kind of solves the U-boat problem at the time. This will change in World War II when U-boats get better, but at the time, this is kind of it. And this is one of the first immediate impacts, and a pretty significant one, because it means that Britain can also safely travel to France now and trade with us and get the supplies they desperately need. So another nail in the coffin of the German Empire. From here, America shows up, and we, in many ways, could not show up at a more appropriate time, because in the most literal sense, Europe is out of people. And I mean like all of Europe. Germany, they've lost pretty much all of their fighting aged individuals. Britain, France, everybody is tired of war. Literal tens of millions of people have died. Nothing has changed. These lines that you see shifted maybe miles, and that's what it's been like for years, and nobody wants to fight anymore. And it's all sort of starting to fall apart at the seams. Russia at this point has pulled back. They're having their own revolution. They're so unhappy with the Russian Tsar, who will actually be killed by his own people later, because they're so displeased with the amount of people dying in the war. And when they run, this gives Germany an opportunity where they're like, okay, we don't need to fight on the Eastern Front anymore, and they can pull all those soldiers and slam into France. And so Germany starts to plot this sort of last-ditch effort, because the people of Germany are not happy either. There's kind of revolution fomenting, people turning against the German Kaiser, and so they realize, like, we need a big win, and we need it now. And so they decide to make a push for Paris. The German high command at the time kind of realizes that they're better, their soldiers are better, and they still have more of them, especially now that they're done fighting Russia, but they need to make a big play. And so they decide, all right, we're going to make a push at a place called Chateau Thierry. Our goal is going to be to split the French and the British forces. We're going to divide them in two, and then from there, we can pretty easily beat the tar out of each of them independently. They can't support each other, and we'll just overwhelm one and then turn on the other. So the Germans, they make the push. At this time, however, the Americans have finally arrived in full force, and we've been doing it really quickly. And so the first American forces arrive, and they immediately rush to Chateau Thierry, and they reinforce the French defenders. The Germans slam into the French lines in their massive charge with some of the largest forces you've seen up until this point. And the line buckles, but it doesn't break. The American reinforcements are enough to keep the French motivated, and because we're so fresh, they don't know how bad it is, and so they also have a lot of high morale and fighting spirit. And so not only do they help hold the line, but then the Americans will actually aggressively pursue the Germans and counterattack. And this will be kind of that moment for the French where, like, oh my goodness, we can do this. These guys, they're ready to go. Let's back them up. And so we'll actually push the Germans back. And this will be the turning point of the war. In his journal, Pershing will compare this to Gettysburg. He argues that this is the Gettysburg of World War I, where for Lee, Gettysburg was this final big push, and it kind of doomed the whole effort when it failed, and he lost his important generals. Similarly, this will be the last sort of major devastating defeat for the Germans, and where they won't be able to make any major offensives after this. And to kind of put that in perspective, it's just so devastating to the Germans that one unit, the 6th Grenadiers, it began the battle with 1,700 soldiers in the unit. And after their charge and after the counterattack, 120 of them remain. So just devastating losses, which isn't just bad because they don't make progress, but it's also bad because all those Germans back home who the high command had promised, like, this is it, this is our big push, we're going to get the French, we're going to divide them, we're going to win, now have to turn around and say, not only were we wrong, this was not the big push, also everybody died, like all of them, huge numbers, are bad guys. And from there, it's going to very quickly spiral out of control for the Germans. For the rest of the year, the American Expeditionary Force is going to participate with the Allies on a variety of fronts. And we're just going to act mostly as a reinforcement. And what's very important to note, and to not get too high on our own success, is that the Americans in this time, our use isn't so much the fact that, like, we're these magical gods of war and we just strode across the battlefield striking down Germans however we saw fit. It's just that we were new and there were a lot of us. In reality, John Pershing, he actually uses the exact same attack strategies of just like, everybody stand up and run at the enemy line that everybody else had used up until this point. And doesn't actually meet with a whole bunch of success because the Germans and Austrians are ready for it. But what does help is that, much like in the Civil War, continuing the analogy of where Grant wasn't a clever general, he was just good at smashing his enemy to pieces with a larger number of soldiers. Similarly, that will be the role of the United States, where in some of the major offensives, like the 100 Days Offensive, that will actually be the last major one of the war and will push all the way to Berlin, the United States was not special. There were just a lot of us. And so, but the fact that we could combine with the French forces to the point where now the numbers are kind of equal between the French and the Germans, and because we're not so demoralized yet, we'll kind of almost naively, willingly charge into enemy gunfire despite heavy losses and just keep doing it because we don't know any better. And that is our contribution to the war. And I mean, it is significant. I don't by any means want to take that away. Without the United States' assistance, it's very likely that France would have collapsed, the German push would have succeeded, and the war would have ended very differently. As it turns out, we showed up, and we helped push it through, and we continued to do so. All the way up until October, on average, about 10,000 additional U.S. soldiers would arrive in France every day, and that additional reinforcement mattered, and it was what was needed to finally break the morale of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottomans, and the Germans. And pretty much overnight, very quickly, we will see a collapse of each of these regimes. The Ottoman Empire will go first. They will have a revolution. The people will be sick of fighting for a king and for nothing and for losing millions, and they will overthrow him. Austro-Hungary will come next. Again, revolution, kick out the king. How dare you kill all our people for nothing? And then lastly will be Germany. And while I note that on November 11th, German Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates his throne, which means that he didn't actually end the war. He actually gave up his position. And on November 11th, when the war, 2 days later, it's actually the new German democracy created by the people overnight that will sign the armistice with the Allies to bring World War I to a close. And all thanks to the U.S. involvement. And so that's that. That's our involvement in the war. Like I said, it really is pretty short. It's about a year of involvement for the United States and only about 6 months of fighting, but it does have its devastating consequences. We help win the war, which is good, and will help benefit us going forward, but it's also worth noting that despite our 8 months of fighting, we had 7% of our people die, which is not high, but that's still a lot. When you think about the number of people that went to go fight, 3 million soldiers, 7% of that is 210,000. So for all intents and purposes, we talked about how 200,000 was the number of soldiers we had at the start of the war. They all died, and it's everybody else who survived. So still very devastating losses for us overall. And looking in the long term, this will also set us up for our next unit, the Roaring Twenties, because this commitment to total war, the mobilization of all of the United States, not just part of it, to fight in this global conflict, is going to have a very transformative effect on our industry and also how our lives focus back at home. And as you can kind of assume, in particular for women, as this image would suggest. But that is for our next unit. So that is all I have for you today. Tomorrow, I guess if you watch this or not tomorrow, but I will be reviewing how this fits in with the other stuff that we've talked about. But the main takeaway of this should be that the United States was not prepared. We mobilized very quickly. We involved our entire nation in this war effort. And because of that, we were able to help win the First World War, even though we were not necessarily more skilled. And it gives us a seat at the table and establishes us as a major world power moving forward. Hopefully that wasn't too long and too painful. Hopefully you kind of gathered some important information from that, or maybe you just didn't watch it at all. But either way, have a wonderful rest of your day and stay healthy in these horrible times. See you.